Hello everyone, Dr. Polaris here. Well, it's finally come to this. I'm going to be covering the vast, confusing group of so-called amphibians known as the Temnospondyls. This incredibly successful group of tetrapods first appeared during the early Carboniferous, and diversified into a staggering array of different species that range from small salamander-like forms to huge 6-metre or 20-foot long crocodile-like ambush predators. They were among the first vertebrates to spend a significant amount of their time on land, although most species were still either fully or partially aquatic. Regardless of their ecological niche, all of these animals needed to return to bodies of fresh water in order to lay their eggs, as many modern amphibians do. Their life histories are also quite well understood, with multiple fossils of larval forms and juveniles having been found, indicating that most of these animals transition to adulthood far more slowly than living frogs and salamanders, which go through a sudden and dramatic metamorphosis. Most would have been aquatic when young, possessing external feathery gills like those of the axolotl, although the juveniles of one family, the Metoposaurids, were terrestrial and then became fully aquatic as adults. Fully grown individuals often developed internal gills, more like those of lungfish, while also utilising lungs to take in oxygen. While some early studies questioned whether Temnospondyls, which persisted for an incredibly long time, between circa 350 million to about 120 million years ago, were an authentic grouping, recent analyses have indeed found them to be a genuine clade. The real controversy regarding these animals lies in their proposed relationships to other tetrapods. As mentioned in my earlier video on heavily debated extinct organisms, the broad consensus view among paleontologists is that Temnospondyls were ancestral to modern least amphibians, the frogs, salamanders and caecilians, probably evolving from the derived Dicerophoid Temnospondyls. However, various other opinions have been put forward over the years, including, but not limited to, the idea that least amphibians are not a natural group, with the caecilians developing from among the Lepospondyls, another group of early tetrapods of uncertain placement. If this was the case, then Temnospondyls would be unrelated to modern amphibians, instead being a more basal lineage of tetrapods, with their similarities being down to convergent evolution. Indeed, Temnospondyls did possess many features of their internal and external anatomy that were known to be different from least amphibians. Many had scaly skin equipped with large armour-like bony plates on the underside of their bodies, in contrast to the soft-skinned living amphibians. Some forms even had bony osteoderm armour running along their backs, such as the early Triassic Laidlaria from South Africa, which provided useful protection for this terrestrial genus. Temnospondyls also often had extensive coverings of teeth on their palates, as well as in their jaws, unlike modern amphibians. Some recent and very important discoveries of basal and early least amphibian fossils have thankfully helped paleontologists to shore up their classification. For example, the late Triassic basal four-legged caecilian Funcus vermis showed many similarities to Dicerophoid Temnospondyls, strongly hinting that living amphibians are all part of the same clade, and should therefore technically be classified as Temnospondyls themselves. However, many more fossil finds are needed to help put this issue to rest once and for all. The oldest and most basal Temnospondyls were forms such as Balanerpaton from the early Carboniferous of Scotland, a smallish, somewhat salamander-like member of the group, measuring about 43 centimetres or 17 inches long. It seems to have been a pretty terrestrial animal, scurrying about in the vast coal swamp forest that made up its home. Along with its close relative Dendropaton from the later Carboniferous, which was also largely terrestrial, this suggests that all Temnospondyls evolved from land-based ancestors. Another basal group, the Idopoids, were notably larger animals and developed vaguely crocodile-like body plans, with big triangular skulls for chomping down on vertebrate prey. The most massive and basal genus was Edops, a powerful 2-metre or 6.6 foot long ambush predator from the Carboniferous Permian boundary of Texas and possibly Scotland. Like all more derived Idopoids, it was probably semi-aquatic like modern crocodiles and alligators, being capable of walking and supporting its own weight on land. Its skull was very broad and heavily built, which gave the animal its name, meaning swollen face. Later forms, such as Chenopprosopus from the early Permian, were smaller, with narrower, pointier snouts and orbits located near the sides of their skull, suggesting that it spent a good deal of time on land. Its bite force was relatively weak, with the animal probably hunting softer-bodied prey. It was once thought that Idopoids died out in the first half of the Permian, although the description of the genus Nigererpeton from the end of the period pushed forward the extinction date of this lineage by around 40 million years. Known from fragmentary cranial remains, it may have been similar to Edops in size, or perhaps even larger at over 2 meters long, being the only Idopoid so far known from Africa, with highly complex teeth, including a pair of fangs at the tip of the lower jaw that was so huge that it needed special holes in its skull for those fangs to fit through so that it could actually close its mouth. Unlike other Idopoids, Nigererpeton was well adapted for an aquatic lifestyle, with a well-developed lateral line system, which would have helped it navigate and detect the movement of prey in murky water. Another lineage that was more completely aquatic were the Divinosaurians, most of which hail from the mid to late Permian, developing at a time in which the global climate was becoming significantly drier, leading to the extinction of various temnospondyle lineages. These animals responded by retaining juvenile traits associated with aquatic habits into adulthood, including unfused vertebrae and powerful tails, enabling Divinosaurians to hide in bodies of water. The type genus Divinosaurus from Russia was a good example of this. Measuring about 1 meter or 40 inches long, this was a gill-breathing, fully aquatic tetrapod, characterised by a large triangular head, short limbs and a long powerful tail. It spent much of its time lying low in bodies of water, with its upward-facing eyes allowing it to target fish and invertebrates from below. The paddle-like tail was the main form of propulsion, unlike many other temnospondyls, which used a wriggling motion in their torsos for movement. Such traits allowed Divinosaurians to survive the end Permian extinction event by hiding in fresh water, with the group persisting into the early Triassic. The most notable of these survivors were the Tupilacossaurids, which were mostly native to the northern hemisphere and swam with eel-like undulations of their long bodies and flexible tails. Interestingly, both Divinosaurians and Idopoids possess larvae that developed slowly, with incompletely ossified skeletons but fast-developing skulls equipped with strong teeth. Irrespective of adult terrestrial or fully aquatic habits, there was no drastic transformation during the later growth cycle, but instead a slow and steady acquisition of adult features. This is very different from modern amphibians, which metamorphose from larvae into their adult forms rapidly. Speaking of this amphibians, they may have evolved from within the big temnospondyle clade Dicerophoidea. Many of these were among the most terrestrial of all early amphibian relatives, and were also often fairly modest in size, especially when compared to some of their enormous predatory cousins that we'll be seeing a bit later in the video. These animals first appeared during the late Carboniferous and survived into the Permian, where they underwent a major diversification event due to their ability to survive in drier conditions. The most basal forms were the Micromelapodontids, which were small salamander-like aquatic forms that retained many neotenic traits into adulthood, such as poorly ossified skeletons and external gills, making them superficially similar to the modern axolotl. The more derived clade Olsoniforms contained the majority of terrestrial species. These included the Trematopids, which were specialised land-living carnivores, which were among the earliest vertebrates to spend the vast majority of their lives out of water, although they would have still needed to return to lakes and pools to lay their eggs. With big triangular skulls, compact bodies and relatively short tails, Trematopids would have resembled a cross between large salamanders and frogs, hunting insects and other invertebrates. My favourite of these is the genus Fedexia, which, yes, is named after the shipping service. Known from the late Carboniferous of Pennsylvania in the United States, circa 300 million years ago, it would have measured about 60 centimetres or 2 feet long, with the animal possibly having salt glands in its nose to help it shed excess sodium chloride, in addition to bumpy skin formed of bony protuberances that served as a defence against predators. Trematopids were close relatives of the Dicerophids, which give their name to the entire clade. These were also well adapted for life on land, with many species possessing notable osteoderms embedded in their skin. Most were rather squat, vaguely frog-like animals with big heads, short but robust limbs and stocky bodies, although they were specialised for walking and not hopping. Some forms were quite bizarre, such as the genus Platyhystrix, which was native to the western United States and straddled the Carboniferous Permian boundary. About 1 metre or 3 feet long, this oddball possessed dorsal vertebrae that were extremely elongated, forming a sail that ran down the animal's back, similar to those of other early Permian tetrapods, such as the unrelated Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus.
which was the style at the time.
As in those organisms, the function of this sail is not well understood. It may have played a role in thermoregulation or perhaps sexual display. Other strange atypical forms included Nuchabea from the early Permian of Oklahoma, which had much longer legs than other members of the family and was probably an active carnivore. Meanwhile, the most diverse group of Dicerophoids were the Amphibarmiforms, containing some of the smallest temnospondyls and potentially gave rise to modern Lysamphibians. Members included the Amphibarmids, which were largely terrestrial and resembled newts with short stubby tails, the salamander-like and often neotenic Branchiosaurids that became more aquatic as time went on, and, finally, animals that seem to have been close relatives of amphibians. Chief among these was the early Permian Garobatrachus from Texas, a tiny genus that could fit in the palm of your hand, and would have looked a bit like a hybrid of a frog and a salamander. It was well suited for scampering about on land, ambushing insects and other invertebrates in the undergrowth. Although sometimes thought to represent a kind of common ancestor of frogs and salamanders, recent findings have placed it outside crown Lysamphibians, but still being a very close relative. This would mean that the common ancestors of modern amphibians had diverged at least by the early Permian and probably earlier. However, the oldest definitive Lysamphibians first appear in the fossil record during the early Triassic, although that's a whole nother can of worms that I'm not going to touch here. Outside of Dicerophoidea, all other temnospondyls were members of the massive clade Eriopiforms. These first appeared during the Carboniferous, with the most basal family being the Eriopids, named after the famous genus Eriops. Native to the latest Carboniferous and Permian, this large, vaguely crocodile-like predator could reach up to 3 meters or 10 feet long, and weighed 489 pounds at a maximum, with a big flattened skull, wide gape, and recurved fangs on the roof of the mouth. Eriops would have been an ambush predator of slippery fish and other smaller temnospondyls. While youngsters spent much of their time submerged, adults had strongly ossified and robust limb bones, which enabled them to move about on land. It inhabited the kind of semi-aquatic ambush hunter niche that would later be taken by the many superficially crocodile-like Archosauromorphs that started to emerge by the end of the Permian. Other more derived Eriopiforms are included in the clade Stereospondylomorpha, most of which were also quite large, vaguely crocodile-like carnivores. Examples include the Permian Archegosaurids, which were fully aquatic and were some of the most massive temnospondyls to ever live. These can be divided into the short-snouted Melosaurinae and the long-snouted Gariot-like Platyoposaurinae, with metabolisms and internal anatomies more similar to those of lungfish than modern amphibians. Some of these animals reached enormous sizes, such as the famous genus Prionosuchus from the early Permian of Brazil, with an elongated tapering snout and hydrodynamic body. This genus seems to have measured just under 2 meters long on average, although very fragmentary material attributed to a far larger individual has also been found, which could have reached about 6 meters or 20 feet long. Feeding on fish and other aquatic invertebrates, Prionosuchus and its relatives would have strongly resembled living gharials, being a great example of convergent evolution. Archegosaurids died out during the mass extinction at the end of the Permian, with their niches later taken by Archosauromorphs. Another group of crocodilian-like temnospondyls, the Rhinosuchids, generally possessed shorter, blunter snouts, and were actually able to survive the end Permian extinction event for a short while, persisting into the early Triassic. One remarkable fossil of the genus Brumistega has been found preserved in the remains of a burrow, alongside the body of the Cynodont Thrinaxodon, indicating that both of these animals may have shared this retreat peacefully in order to avoid the drought conditions raging above. Meanwhile, the more derived stereospondyls were better able to survive the Great Dying and underwent a diversification event during the Triassic, despite the presence of semi-aquatic Archosauromorphs now filling similar niches. These can be placed into 2 broad groups, the Capitosaurians and the Trematosaurians. Both lineages thrived during the Triassic, with some species even becoming tolerant of salt water. Capitosaurs produced many species of crocodile-like ambush predators, with by far the most massive and famous being the genus Mastodonsaurus. Spending most of its time submerged in water, this huge animal was among the largest temnospondyls, reaching up to 6 meters or 20 feet in length. In fully grown adults, the flattened skull could reach almost 2 meters long and was equipped with big pointed fangs at the tip of the lower jaw for skewering prey. These were so large that they protruded through the upper jaw when the animal had its mouth closed. In life, it would have been the terror of Middle Triassic European waterways. Its tail was likely thickened with a fleshy fin for propulsion. The stronger tail, in combination with small limbs, a trunk section stiffened with long broadened overlapping ribs, and extra heavy bones, would indicate that Mastodonsaurus was an aquatic ambush predator that lurked on the bottom in wait of prey, making sudden rapid attacks with its giant mouth and impaling lower teeth. Capetosaurs died out at the end of the Triassic, although this wasn't the case for their sister group, the Trematosaurians. These also thrived during the Triassic and were similarly aquatic predators, although they were notably far more diverse in body plan than the Capetosaurs. Examples include the marine Trematosaurids, which strongly resembled gharials and developed a very broad range around the coastal regions of Pangaea. A few modern amphibians are fairly salt tolerant, and the crab-eating frog makes brief excursions into seawater, but no other known amphibian-like animals have ever taken it to quite the extreme the Trematosaurids did. They were thought to have died out at the end of the Triassic, although a fossil pelvic bone from China suggests a few may have persisted for at least another 40 million years into the Middle Jurassic, potentially making them one of the longest-lived group of temnospondyls. Other Trematosaurians tended to possess shorter, blunter snouts, making them look more like living giant salamanders of East Asia. The Metoposaurids were a good example, with genera such as Anaschisma from the late Triassic of the American Southwest being very common elements of their ecosystems. Reaching about 10 feet long, this animal possessed eyes that were located very far forward on its snout, and spent much of its time lying on the riverbed, waiting for fish to swim close by, and then quickly engulfing the prey in its massive open jaws. Other Trematosaurians went against the aquatic grain, however, including the strange-looking early Triassic genus Laidlaria from South Africa. Rather small for a temnospondyl, it possessed a wide, flat body covered with a significant amount of dermal armour. This indicates that this animal was quite terrestrial, which is odd when compared to the rest of the clade. It was among the last of the land-living temnospondyls, which vanished after the early Triassic. However, the longest-lived clade were the Brachiopoids. While the vast majority of temnospondyls died out at the end of the Triassic, this lineage continued to thrive in the Jurassic. All species were mostly aquatic predators with large blunt snouts and goofy-looking upward-facing eyes. These consisted of the Brachiopods, which would have resembled the living giant salamanders in appearance and persisted until the end of the Jurassic. A currently unnamed enormous specimen from South Africa may have reached about 7 meters or 23 feet long, making it one of the largest of all temnospondyls. Their sister family, the Chagoutosaurids, became widespread across Gondwana by the late Triassic, with their remains having been found in Australia, India and Argentina. Most of these were relatively large, reaching over a metre long, and were clearly tolerant of cool, temperate climatic conditions. The most massive forms were both native to Australia, with the lesser-known early Jurassic Siderops possessing a total length of up to 2.7 metres or 8.9 feet. However, by far the most famous member of this family was the genus Coolosuchus from the early Cretaceous of Victoria, Australia, largely due to its starring role in the Spirits of the Ice Forest episode of Walking with Dinosaurs. About 3 metres or 10 feet long, and inhabiting fast-flowing rivers and creeks in a cool temperate ecosystem, Coolosuchus was probably a generalist ambush hunter, feeding on any smaller animal it could fit in its wide mouth, from fish to amphibians to elasmerian ornithopod dinosaurs such as Quantosaurus. The environment in which Coolosuchus lived seems to have been a bit too chilly for crocodilomorphs, which probably allowed this animal to reach such large sizes. By 110 million years ago, represented by rocks in the Dinosaur Cove fossil locality, temperatures had warmed and crocodilian relatives had returned to the area. These archosaurs likely displaced Coolosuchus, leading to its disappearance in younger rocks, although there is currently no direct evidence of this. Regardless, the extinction of Coolosuchus marked the end of the extraordinary temnospondyls, which were able to bounce back from several extinction events and thrive for about 230 million years, living in all kinds of different ecosystems, from deserts to coastal ocean waters, and producing a staggering array of very different looking species. The temnospondyls may technically not even be extinct at all, given that these amphibians probably evolved from among them. Despite recent fossil material, such as the Proto-Sicilian Fungus vermis, providing strong evidence that modern amphibians are indeed descended from Dicerophoid temnospondyls, This debate is almost certainly not settled, and will continue to rumble on among paleontologists for many years to come. Thanks for watching, everyone. For some reason, the YouTube algorithm has decided not to promote my channel as much recently. But despite this, I'm going to still be celebrating my 50k milestone next week, with a special crossover episode on dinosaur art and media from the 1950s to the late 70s. I've reached out to Dino Diego, who runs a fantastic channel focusing on prehistoric pop culture, and I'm honoured that he's agreed to do a collab with me. You can expect us to cover the Flintstones, more kaiju, prehistoric beasts as symbols of consumerism, the dinosaur renaissance, and, of course, a lot of schlock. See you again soon. Cheerio.